for folks that are just maybe getting into random encounters in the first time, maybe don't know too much about random encounters, I figured we'd start with a really simple question of what is random encounters? Um, Dix, do you have thoughts on that, or you want me to kind of just go with that one?
I can take that.
Cool, cool.
Yeah, so random encounters are basically something that you're going to use to kind of make your world feel a little bit alive, especially during times of like travel. Most of the
Mm,
time, they are generated from you rolling on a list, and they will be things that your players can run into along their way from point A to point B, or just exploring area X. If they've got a wide area that they're searching through, maybe for specific clues, here are some other things that they can run into while they're looking for those clues or whatever their quest is at, what quest has them doing. Um, a lot of the time, the lists are pre-generated so that you know kind of what's going on in the areas your players are going to be passing through. But even then, as James said, it kind of keeps the DM on their toes too, because they don't exactly know what encounter is going to get brought up and how your players are going to react to it.
yeah, I think that was actually a really good explanation. I don't know that I have too much to add on to that, but yeah, they're just. I'm gonna try anyway. Uh, yeah, they're encounters that you get to add in on the fly. That traveling is one of my favorite times to do it. I think that's one of the things that makes like if you're not just gonna gloss over traveling, saying like you leave the port in city A and travel 3,000 miles to city B, and now you're there. Random encounters give a great way to flesh that out without having to figure out like what's there every step of the way, and that works like oversea, on land, etc. Some folks like to do it in dungeons too, and if you go back to like D&D's roots, random encounters in dungeons were like definitely a thing, but that was more in an era of and you'll find this today in like old school essentials and things where like there were dungeon turns where it took 20 minutes to search a room, and for each dungeon turn you had to roll an encounter and whatnot. And I think dungeons have gotten a little less rigid in their implementation as time goes on, for better or worse. But yeah, and those I think that's a great explanation of what random encounters are. And I think they are often usually on a rollable table, but lately I've been seeing them and also experimenting them with like using cards and things like that. Each card being keyed toward an encounter, and the benefit of that being once you draw that card and you put it aside, you can't have that encounter again. Um, but there's really no wrong way as far as that goes. So I think that brings us, and I think we touched on this a little bit already, of when to use them, and I also think there's times not to as well. Uh, Dix, in your games, when do you use random counters? When do you bring them up?
Most of the time in my games, I'm using random encounters mostly for travel. Normally, when you're trying to get from point A to point B, and you want the area, you want the world to feel like it's alive. So nobody's going to spend an entire week long trip walking from one town to the next and just not see anything. That's not how the world works. You're going to run into things along the way, and not everything on your random encounters list has to be a fight. It should be focusing on things that are going to make your world feel alive and kind of spice things up and give you the opportunity to not just be like, you get from point A to point B, you're done, now we're on to the next thing.
Yeah, and I think an interesting thing about what you just said there, or maybe like what wasn't said, but what lived in those words somewhere, was I don't think that random encounters, like I think one of the things that people complain about random encounters for is also potentially one of their strengths, is that a lot of people feel like maybe they derail the game or they don't have to do with like the main plot. And man, let me tell you, when I go to 7-Eleven at like 12 o'clock at night to pick up some pecan twirls, dude, stuff happens that is not in the plot by the time I get back, and that's maybe the best part of the trip, you know?
Absolutely.
Uh, and now you let you know how I spend my time. But yeah, I feel like that's an important thing about traveling is what you didn't expect. And for a DM, they can potentially work that into the plot from there, especially if like a encounter gets left like unresolved. Like let's just say we go for like the simple example of a goblin battle and some goblins escape, that can come back to haunt you. Or maybe it
Absolutely.
doesn't. Maybe it was a one and done. But I don't think there's a wrong way there. Um, I digress. But yeah, when I use random encounters, a lot of times it's travel as well. Not solely, but that's my favorite time to use them. I not for every campaign, but for a lot of campaigns, I really like to do hex-based overland travel. I like the idea of like each hex is 6 miles. You can go 6 hexes in a day if it's just like regular terrain, and then you have to rest. Um, and each hex you go into, maybe there's nothing there. It's just woods. That's when you roll a random encounter and see what happens and see how that travel goes. Uh, Depending on your playstyle and the group you're playing with, and also what edition you're playing too. One of the fun things about this is, oh, Nicole, you're in luck. You actually didn't miss much because we had technical difficulties that almost lasted a half hour. You're only like 5-10 minutes into this. Um, but anyway, uh, I think random encounters could be a good way to interact with like resource management and things like that, and especially if like you're playing older editions, or if you're using like the alternate healing rules in 5e where you don't heal all your hit points on a long rest. uh, Random encounters can make you think about how far you want to travel and like where you can find a safe space, especially at earlier levels before you can start like throwing up the hut. Dix, help me out. What's the hut that you can
Lehman's tiny hut.
Liamon's, yeah. I'm like, it's not Mordenkainen. Mordenkainen doesn't get a hut. Um, but yeah, and then when you're also thinking of things in terms of like rations and things like that, like random encounters can be kind of interesting then. But traveling isn't the only time I'll throw those out. Sometimes I will key random encounters to like rooms in a like, well, finger quotes dungeon. Like I once made an inn that was really extensively mapped out. Well, Brad and I did, and like whenever you went to the inn, there was a different chance of a random encounter happening in there. And random encounters were like they didn't really deal with the players per se. They dealt with the inn itself, and they dealt with the world, which is one of the tricks of making the world feel alive. Like I think one of my favorite ones was the bar or the tavern owner was brokering a truce between like two rival like pirate gangs. And that had nothing to do with the players, but how cool is that to walk into? That's an uncomfortable situation when you're just trying to get your pecan twirls at 12
Oh
o'clock
yeah,
at
that could
night
be
at a
super
7-Eleven.
tense.
Yeah. Yeah. City like Lackmire, like they're great for city-based campaigns as well. And I think part of it depends on your scope of what your game is. Is it a world-spanning campaign? Like for that, like things like hexes make sense. But when I look at city-based campaigns, or one of the games I've been kind of enamored with lately is Into the Odd, and it's like kind of sibling game Electric Bastionland, which all takes place in one city. Uh, but their campaign prep, you basically like it's point crawling, and a quick explanation of that is you have your destinations, be that like the factory, the tavern, the docks, whatever, and you have your ways of which you get to them, be the subway, a certain street, whatever, and each destination has a list of encounters, and each mode of transportation has a list of encounters too. So yeah, there's like a lot of opportunity you can use random encounters, and you can even use them in a dungeon. Like every so often, like you could time it. So many certain amount of rooms in a dungeon you roll for encounter, or every time they take a short or long rest. If it's 5e in a dungeon, you could roll to see if there's an encounter. But I also feel like, and I know I've been hyping up random encounters all week. Like folks on the mailing list are probably like sick of hearing me talk about random. No, you're probably not. You're here, right? But I think there are times to like not use random encounters. I don't think they work for every game structure, as much as I love them. For instance, Dix and I are we're playing a Conan 2D20 Conan game. Which has been a hell of a lot of fun.
It's been a blast.
Yeah, and it's kind of honestly a little bit linear. Like it's not like I plan out everything the players are going to do, but I kind of know like, okay, this is going to happen, and then this is going to happen next. And I think that is a different style of game, and I think it fits the narrative of that one well. Um, and I think it also all helps that like uh, it's a bunch of professional DMs playing the game that makes it roll so well. But for a narrative structure like that, it's I could see how random encounters could throw it off. So I don't think you need to use them everywhere. Ooh, I'm sorry, I just saw Nicole writing in the chat about have you guys seen the Hexflower method of randomizing encounters? I just stumbled over it. It seems cool but involved.
I have not seen that.
It's really cool. Like, okay, so think of a hex, and then think of like all like that hex in the middle has hexes bordering that,
Mm-hmm.
and then one more layer out, right?
Okay.
Okay, so that's a hex flower, and it's something along the lines of like you roll 2d6 and each result is keyed to a direction you move.
Okay.
So why that's important? Like my favorite way to use hex flowers is for weather. And so let's say you have just like plain sunny day in the middle. So everything around that plain sunny day is going to be things like a plain sunny day might lead to: slightly overcast, light
Okay. Yeah.
drizzle,
Yeah.
hot out, you know. But it doesn't go directly to say like tundra, storm, death, you know.
Yeah.
So then you take that second layer and put the things that they might lead into next. So it's kind of like a how do I want to put this? Like if you're rolling for say weather on like a regular random table, you could get anything at any time.
Yeah.
Like hex flowers are a good way for natural progression, and I haven't really yeah, what Nicole said there. The moves aren't physical moves, they affect what kind of encounter you get or weather or setting. Nicole, if you haven't seen it, check out um Frig. Planar Compass. The second Planar Compass does amazing things with uh, hex flowers and travel. And Planar Compass is like a jaunt through the ethereal sea, but the way they just and the idea is like anything could come up. So like having a straightforward physical map doesn't work, but
Mm-hmm.
it does have that kind of like you're getting closer to this plane, and the hex flower kind of controls that. Anyway, sorry I geeked out over that, but it kind of got me excited. Um, so yeah, we were talking about rolling tables, when to use them and when to not. So yeah, there are times not to use random encounters, and I do encourage everyone to look into hex flowers. That is definitely a cool way you can implement them. That is different than I feel like the accepted norm.
Yeah.
But yeah, like when things feel stale, you can also throw in random encounters, and just like if your gut seems like something needs to happen here, roll on a table. We're making camps. Oh, Nicole, please do. This is we're hanging out, right? Um, so I talked a lot about like hex crawls and point crawls for random encounters. Does anyone watching, like anyone in the chat right now, do you use those campaign structures as well? Like, do those make sense? Should I explain anything more about them? Laws, I prefer being as surprised as my players, so I'm not in good DM or evil DM mode. I'm neutral. Yeah, man, not having any agenda about the success or failure. I welcome their ideas with more enthusiasm, and they feel it. Surprise makes memories. Stories are forgotten. Ooh, that's good, dude. That's good. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things we're gonna get into a little later is uh, random encounters is kind of a remedy to railroading and what it can do for a DM. Like they're not just for the players to play with;
Mm-hmm.
they're also for the DM. Um, okay, so where were we at with that? Oh, actually, I guess that's what we're talking about next. Is the secret to not railroading players? Um, Dix, do you have any thoughts on this? Do you want to?
To not railroading players.
Yeah, like through random encounters, basically.
Yeah. So, uh, through random encounters, one thing I like about them, and especially in regards to not railroading your players, is I like to look at it as like instant inspiration for the GM. You could be in your game, just be like, oh, these guys are going from point A to point B. And then once you see that random encounter that you roll, suddenly sparks like a story in your mind of like, okay, why are they coming across this group? What are these people doing?
Mm-hmm.
What are these monsters here for? Why are they here? Why in this area? And how do I make it seem logical to the group so that it's not just like you just randomly walk upon these things for no reason whatsoever? And how do I maybe possibly tie this in later?
And I think like you said some really cool stuff there, especially like the why are they here, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, and like again, this is something we got coming up a little later, but like I think a lot of random encounter tables are here's 2d6 goblins.
Yeah.
Okay, are they 2d6 goblins like with their dicks in their hands, just standing there waiting for heroes to come along and
Are they on patrol?
right. And I think a lot of people have trouble seeing past that like 2d6 goblins to what it could be.
Oh yeah, this is just supposed to be a list of things that we fight along the way.
Right. And I think that always the fun question, especially for world building, is why? Why are they here to fight, or are they even here to fight?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
I think one of my favorite random encounters I wrote was the players come upon like three farmers. They have a goblin tied up, and they're arguing over what to do with the goblin. And the reason is because that's like it's a question and not an answer, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the DM doesn't know how that's going to play out. Like that's all up to the players, and that's important. And so that's also like as much as the DM may have planned that encounter, they need to react as to what is happening as well because they don't have the answer written out. I mean, that's just the thing, Tapchill. I would never interrupt a goblin circle jerk. You just gotta let that happen. I mean, that's me as a player. The paladin might have different minds, but like maybe it's the bard in me. But I'm like, I'm just gonna roll perception 20 times in a row.
Yeah, right. Make sure I don't lose sight of it.
This might be important. There might be a ritual I gotta watch. All right.
Where's the scribe?
Are we kicked off Facebook yet? Or are we still? No, we're good. Okay. But yeah, so I think that's puts the DM in a position much like the players are, in that they are reacting to both the game world and the players, just as the players are reacting to the DM and the game world. Like, if you've been getting our emails, you probably saw my rant about like the game world and the rules being the secret third player. And I think it's important that they have their say, and you have to react to that as well. And it also, I think, helps make the world feel more alive. Like, in a sense that it doesn't just revolve around the player characters. Something is happening that doesn't have to do with them at all. Maybe they get involved, maybe they don't, you know?
Yeah, it makes them feel more like they're reacting to the world than they're just reacting to the DM.
Right. Recently, a few weeks ago, the players came upon, like, they rolled some really good perception checks, and they saw, I forget what monster I was using, but they just saw it hunting off in the swamp, and they stood there for a few moments, and they were like, nah, we're not dealing with this, and they just, like, snuck away from it, and it worked, and it was fine. They didn't have to fight it, but
yeah,
that was also, like, it was an interesting choice, and I think RPG games are largely about making interesting choices and how the mechanics support that. Yeah.
I think one more thing I wanted to add with using random encounters as like the secret to not railroading players is kind of circling back to where every encounter doesn't have to be a fight. When you set up your random encounters list, make like half of them social interactions. Make sure there's no combat, like at least not an obvious sign that this is supposed to be a combat.
Yeah, I think that okay. So when I'm feeling really spunky, I like to organize my random encounters into 4 categories, and the weight of each category depends on where they are. Are they really close to a city in a like kind of civilized land, traveling roads? That's going to have a different balance than are they in the bumblefuck nowhere in the middle of the woods, surrounded by horrible monsters. So my 4 categories are monsters or likely combat, like dangerous things, uh, the wild, which is things like inclement weather events or flooding, or like just like things you might find if you were going hiking. You know what I mean? And that could be something as banal as you come across some mushrooms. They might be edible. You could roll a check to find out. You know, especially if you're using like resourcey games where they might find food out in the wild or stuff. So yeah, I'm sorry, I digress. So fighting, nature, civilization, which basically like, did they come across someone else's camp? Did they come across an NPC merchant? Did they come across some pilgrims going to the next town over to hang out at the temple? And finally, and this is usually the smallest category, weird. Like, just batshit crazy stuff. Like, stuff that doesn't necessarily make sense for where they are. Uh,
Sure.
yeah, and I think one of my, like, for example, one of them I had was they find a broken summoning circle and a dead wizard. Uh, which, like, you know, that's not something you run across every day unless you are going to the same 7-Eleven I'm going to. Uh, and, you know, that's a great way to both make the players paranoid because they can be asking the same question as the DM is asking at that point. What the fuck happened here? Right?
Yeah, totally.
And just to get back to the chat for a moment.
I
Yeah,
was going to
Nicole
bring
and
that up
John.
also.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have things you want to?
Oh no, I was just going to bring up Nicole's comment because I think that's really important.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And I think starting with those tables is fine. And if you're like feeling real flexible, you can kind of you can use them and figure out what's going on there. But I think it's more fun if you take them and then modify them for your purposes. Like, there's a lot of general terrain based random encounter tables out there, and they're fine, they're fun, but like they are very generalized, and the only person who's going to be able to like really dial it in for your game is you. Um, but yeah, John, what I would so John, I got two suggestions for you, and one of them is like, yeah, take one of those tables and then think about your game world and where things are and modify it to fit that. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that too, either in chat or you can even just like email me at crumblingkeep@gmail.com. And the second one, it's the second one I'll talk about actually a little later. That comes with the little offer that I have that's going to be going on. Um, uh, oh yeah, so one of the things you may have heard me say throughout this is play to find out, which is it's a phrase I read that I really enjoy, and it's a game running philosophy of, and Dix has said this in like not so many words already, uh, not having a solution in mind, playing to see what happens, bringing up that random encounter and seeing where it goes. And yeah, Dix, like when you run a game, like tell me about your prep. Like how does that factor into your prep for you?
So I was actually going to bring that up because hearing you say that, like it immediately had me thinking. Like when I first started DMing and started like prepping for sessions, I was absolutely like, I would absolutely freak out over anything that happened that I hadn't planned for. I was just like, I didn't plan for this. I don't know how I'm supposed to react to this. I don't know how it's supposed to move on afterwards. What's going on? Uh, but now I've very much like gotten more used to just getting my points laid out. Like, okay, these are the like three major things I need to happen this session. How do I get them there? And random encounters can be a big part of that. I think just having a couple notes and then kind of running with it, even if you're not doing it all the time, but practicing that every once in a while is going to make you a better DM, just in general. And being able to read your players' reactions and take what they like and kind of just run with that, the more and more you do that is monumental.
Yeah, I like to hang out with like when I do my prep. A lot of times, I'll do just a series of bullet points
Mm-hmm.
and make sure there's plenty of room between them for things to breathe.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that helps with that is when you prep your game, if you like, I like to prep more pieces than happenings. Uh,
Yeah,
like putting thoughts together in my head here.
no worries.
Like, okay, in this town, I know, and okay, so actually, the Conan game we're playing, when you got to that last city, that this is a good example of it. Is I wrote out all the important people in the city. I wrote out all of the factions in the city, and like who wants to do what and who doesn't like who.
Hmm.
And then I wrote out like, okay, this night these things are happening. I mean, it didn't matter if the PCs were involved in it or not, but these
Yeah.
things are going to be happening, and it allowed me to more like it. I just react to the players like, oh, you're going this direction, you know, like I set it up. The very first scene in the city where they were in the king's chambers, and there's a lot of important NPCs in there, and they were reading people's glances and seeing who's whispering to who and things like that. And then I just kind of turned them loose to see what direction they went. But since I had those pieces to play with, I could just plug them in. Um, and Nicole, that game I'm talking about in particular is kind of like a mix of both, right? It was one of my more like, especially getting up to the city, like this happens and this happens and this happens, and then the city was a little more sandboxy. Um, but yeah, we were also talking about like things like sandboxy hex crawls earlier as well, and how random encounters can and can't fit into some of those. So yeah, like random encounters don't fit into everything, but I do
Yeah.
like where they do.
And again, with your comment, Nicole, I think it just kind of depends on the game you're running and like what kind of feel you're going for or have been cultivating in your game. I feel like it also could depend on just like where you're at in your storyline too. Sometimes you're just leading up to a major plot point and you have certain things that are just going to happen with the timeline that your characters find themselves on. But maybe you're playing a more survival exploration kind of game where you just instead plan out where things are going to happen and kind of like you said, James, just kind of like figuring out relationships between the people in the area. And then as the characters find them and interact with them, those stories are just going to play themselves out on their own.
Yeah, and I think part of that is prepping questions instead of answers. You know,
Exactly.
um, going back to that like summoning circle, that's a question, not an answer. It doesn't tell
Mm-hmm.
us what's going to happen. It just tells us what has happened, and it just uh, it creates an open loop of sorts. Like in a perfect world, your D&D game or any RPG game is full of a bunch of tiny mysteries. Um, and I think that is a better reward cycle than any gold piece or magical weapon you could find. Is figuring out what made that magic circle, what is making that noise in the next room, what left these like drag marks through the dust here. You know, like you just keep wanting to know those answers. Uh, Having checkpoints, sometimes you're focusing on them and not on the player, so I prefer following their steps and being ahead. Um, yeah, like I think honestly, I do vary between the two. There are games that uh, I run checkpoints type things with, and it's more like I kind of do it based on who I'm playing with and what type of game it is. Um, but yeah, I definitely see what you're saying though. Like having that like pieces and seeing what they do is definitely a way to just kind of like let the players take the reins, and then you have to play along with them as well.
Yeah.
Uh, so quick like 101 on organizing random encounters. So anyone who like hasn't really used them before might be like kind of swimming in information now, being like, okay, so how do I actually do it? So question I have for folks in the chat: uh, do any of you have any favorite random encounter resources? As we start to go over this, feel free to post some URLs or like names or whatever in the chat, and feel free to share. Uh, Dix actually, I think, might have something coming up about this. Do you want to talk about that or not yet?
No, I can talk about it.
Okay, cool. I didn't want to like force it, but like we were talking
Yeah,
about it right
no.
before we started the chat. I'm like, ooh, that sounds dope.
Yeah. So this I can't take credit for. I stole this from a buddy of mine, Max Hobbs, who Some of you in the chat may know. He is also one of the hosts on the Help Action podcast that I'm a part of. Great DM, amazing dude. But he came up with this system called danger numbers. So this takes place after you figured out the area your players are traveling in, and you've already got your random encounter lists kind of set aside. But so danger numbers is a system where, depending on how dangerous the area is, or the threat level, or I guess how much interaction really is what it comes down to, how much interaction you want your players to have with a certain area, you ask them to give you you ask them to pick out a designated amount of numbers between 1 and 100. So if it's a pretty easygoing trip, you're not expecting much to happen, you just ask from one from each of your player. If it's a pretty dangerous area and they're going to be having to like stay on their toes, maybe ask for like 3 of them from each of your players. But then as you're traveling, you decide certain intervals that you want them to be checking for encounters. And as they hit those intervals, so a lot of the times I'm running an Icewind Dale game where when they're out in the tundra, I normally ask for one every hour because it's a pretty dangerous area and there's all sorts of threats out there. So when that check comes up, you just ask everybody to roll a D100. If they roll any of the numbers that they had previously given you, you have a random encounter.
Okay, reasons I love that is how it involves the player, and I feel like it ups the tension too. Like
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good.
It kind of puts the random encounters in the player's hands and not the DM's hand. It's not the DM just sitting there rolling dice behind a screen, being like, "Hold on, let me see if you guys are doing anything." They get to make the rolls, and like you said, the tension is just so much higher, especially if they've already had a couple encounters on their way. They're like, "Oh, we don't know if we can handle another one. We need to find a place to rest." It really puts tension in that regard. But the great thing about using the system is that the DM also has their own number or 2, or depending. And if you hit one of the DM numbers, then the stakes are much higher for that encounter.
Ooh, yeah, I kind of love that.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun, especially when you make your numbers known to players and they start like rolling really close to the number. It ups that bit of tension even more.
It's kind of like playing the lottery, except if you win, you're probably going to die instead.
Yeah.
Oh, that's dope. Wow.
Yeah.
I'm going to have some thoughts about that. Cool.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. I suggest people try it out.
So, for folks that might be wanting to organize their own encounters, I have a few thoughts of ways you could categorize them, right? Because you're probably not going to run into the same encounters in your home city as you are in RPG Kino, as you are in like the Arctic tundra or whatever. And I think one of the most classic ways to do it is to do it by terrain type, and the classic D&D terrains, and you can get it as minutia in this as you want. But going back in like D&D history, their classic terrains for this are Arctic, coast, desert, forests, grasslands, mountains, swamp, and underdark. And I would add civilization to that as well if you want to get funky with it. And that's one way to like tool the encounters to where the players are. If you want to get even like fancier, sure, you can do forest, but what if you did the Duskgloom forest, or the Swamp of Sad Boys, or the Duchy of what have you? So taking sections in your world that you've like world built, or like a world that exists, whatever, that you know what's kind of happening there, and basing random encounters off of that. And you don't have to go that far, but that does bring a little bit more liveness to the world. And the next one is, I don't want to say controversial, but we're going to talk about it afterwards, is by level or adventuring tier. And if we're looking at like 5e, we got levels 1 to 4, the local heroes 2 to 5. No, it's 2 to 5? What's 2 to 5? Whatever,
5
2 to
5.
10. And then 5 to 10. There we go. 1 to 4, 5 to 10, Heroes of the Realm. 11 to 17, Masters of the Realm, and 17 to 20, Masters of the World. So if you want your random encounters to be kind of like matched to where your players are, that's a thing to think of as well. However, let's talk about balance and what it's good for. Dix, you balance your random encounters?
Yes and no. I There's definitely something to be said about balance. They should, not necessarily feel like they're being punished, but there is also something to be said to have at least just one random encounter on your list that absolutely makes your players shit their pants. Uh, that definitely has them being like, oh, fuck, can we actually deal with this threat right now? Are we able to do something about this? Uh, and
Yeah.
I mean, and in reality, that's just how things are sometimes. Sometimes you wander into a place that you should not be in,
Mm-hmm.
and come up against a monster that you cannot deal with, and you just need to figure out how to hide and run. Um, or if it's an intelligent creature, how do you talk your way out of it?
The same group that I was talking about that saw the thing hunting and noped out of there, when they were first level, I rolled a random encounter that was some hellhounds, and they heard them howling, and they were like, "Okay, we probably don't want to deal with that." And then they saw what it was, and it was basically a race to get to civilization and away from the hellhounds, which involved them like making some great survival rolls and trying to hide and things like that. And I honestly, that seemed a lot. I remember that more than most of the combats they had. So personally, like, I think it's important to talk to your players about it, at least to let them know what to expect in terms of like, hey, all of these encounters aren't going to be balanced, or they are, or like, feeling out what they want and whatnot.
Sure.
Um, but that said, like, personally, like, I love non-balanced random encounters, and I have like a few rules for them though that I like to go by. Uh, if it's something that they can't, like something that's like extremely dangerous to them, especially for players that don't know the monster manual inside and out and haven't been playing long or something like that, I like to telegraph that danger.
Hmm.
Be that through story, like, oh, this thing just like ripped down a tree or killed something that we had trouble with before, or whatever. Or sometimes I will just like outright say it. Like, if it's something their characters would know but the players didn't, like, oh yeah, this is something that you have heard terror stories about from like everyone since you were young, and 20 people it's personally killed. Like, I don't think you have to be afraid of being too heavy-handed there, and you'll find your balance yourself, whatever. Um, but yeah, I think it's important to telegraph, and I also like to make sure it's not like an instant death trap. Give them that chance to run away, and if they have like a good idea on how to deal with it, like definitely roll with that. Uh, like Dix, you said like we're not here to punish the players, you know, but if we can make them think and like think outside of the rolling dice for a moment, that's also pretty cool.
Yeah, not every encounter has to end in fighting. I again, in one of my Icewind Dale games, I rolled a random encounter where they saw a white dragon, and they were in the process of climbing a mountain when this random encounter came up. So instead of them just having to like come across a dragon that they needed to fight, that they were clearly not at a level of being able to handle. Instead, this dragon just happened to like fly over the ridge that they were on, not see them, and I made everybody make some checks to avoid being hit by its tail as it flew by. Which that for a low level party, getting smacked by a dragon's tail is could be a pretty big deal, especially when you ask them to make checks to hold on to the ledge that they're clinging to and not fall to their death in that way. Uh, you know, not
uh,
everything has to be a fight.
yeah, I love that, and particularly, I think part of the thing I love about it is like the dragon doesn't have to give a fuck about them. It's a dragon,
Yeah,
like that's
it
why they
knows it
might be
can eat
like,
them.
yeah. There's better meals out there. It's like seeing a free Subway sandwich in the gutter and being like, I don't
Yeah,
need that.
exactly.
I'm just gonna step on it as I go by. Uh, yeah, Laws brings up reaction rolls, which for anyone that doesn't know, and this is a thing from like old school D&D. When the players meet a monster, you can make a reaction roll to see kind of like what that monster is thinking of them from the get go. Like, does that monster want to fight them? Or does that monster want to be left alone? Does the monster want to flee? Maybe the monster's friendly. Maybe, especially like if you go with like the popular kind of like, okay, I made a dungeon and there's different factions in it. Maybe that monster wants to recruit them or something. Um, One of the things I find fascinating about some like earlier editions of D&D is XP wasn't based around what you killed as much as it was based around how much money you got. Like gold piece translated to XP. And that seems weird at first, but then one of the cool things about that is it takes the focus away from combat. Like, there's something big guarding that treasure. Maybe you don't want to kill it. Maybe you don't want to trick it. Maybe you want to, like, make a deal with it, you know? I think, oddly, like, it sounds like it would be less role-playing, but in some ways I think it encourages it in a different way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, not all dragons want to eat you. Some do want to talk, and hopefully they want to talk. Uh, your monster should feel a little bit alive. I mean, not all the time. Sometimes it's just grunts and people like to roll dice and kill things. But like, uh, uh I think. Sorry, I just had a remembrance of Stinkfoot, a goblin name I've used in various games. But the first time I ever used it, it was this goblin that had only one boot and a kind of like decaying, festering foot on the other side. It was the goblin tribe priestess who worshipped a lake of mercury, which explained a lot when the players found the magic lake. But anyway, yeah. And I think that's also going to go into something I want to like talk about in a little bit of leveling up your random encounters. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything real quick on my list of notes here. Real quick, triggers. I think sometimes people, when they're getting into it, like need the when to roll a random encounter, and ultimately that's up to the DM. Dix, you have some thoughts about that? Like when you roll them or make players roll them?
Well, like I said, so I've pretty much been using danger numbers for random encounters pretty exclusively for a while. Um, the Really, it's just kind of knowing your setting, knowing your story, and uh, kind of figuring out why people are going to interact. Why, like, traveling is obviously a big one. Moving into new areas, uh, and then situations that are pretty, like you said, you don't want things to get stale. You want things to kind of keep moving. So, I mean, I think that alone is like a perfect trigger.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the party's getting a little bit too comfortable. Here, make a roll. Uh, oh, your my one of my favorite ones is making players, or I pretty much always have a random encounter anytime a party tries to take a rest in a dungeon. It's a bad idea. Don't sleep in dungeons, people. They're called dungeons for a reason.
It really is. Like, who here slept in a dungeon and lived to tell the tale? I mean, it's just
Unless you've completely cleared it out, and even then, it's a dungeon. Those monsters had to get in there somehow, so
right.
they're probably going to be able to find a way back in.
And someone's like, "Ooh, free real estate."
Yeah, I mean that's how most dungeons come up, right?
Yeah, I think there's like, so when I was preparing for this, I asked a friend of mine, like, "When do you use random encounters?" And their answer kind of blew my mind a bit. And I don't think it's a wrong answer. It's just like different than what I do, which led me to think like, oh, so there's hard counters for or hard triggers for random encounters, like you move to a new hex, or like you get into a new location or dungeon room or whatever, like a definite like if X happens then I Y type of like random encounter rolling. And she was just like, yeah, I roll them when I feel like it, like when I feel like it needs a random encounter, and that like it's like that seems really valid, and also I would never think to do that, you know, which was kind of cool.
Yeah.
So then there's like deciding how you want, once you know what your triggers are going to be, like what triggers a random encounter for you, uh, there's figuring out how you want to roll them. One way you could do it is have like a percentage. So first off, danger numbers, which I didn't know the full story of until tonight, which is just dope, right? So that kind of fits like both things. It gives you your chance of having random encounters and also tells you what, or like potentially tells you what your random encounter is, I would guess as well, because I imagine there's encounters maybe assigned to the numbers or maybe not. I guess I could go either way, right?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so there's that, or you could have like a okay, there's a this place is relatively safe. There's a 1 in 6 chance of a random encounter happening here, or like this is a terrible place. There's a 5 in 6 chance of having a random encounter here, and if you roll within that range, then you roll on the random encounter table. The other idea is you could have like okay, it's a D100 random encounter table, 1 through 70 nothing happens, or 1 through 80 nothing happens, and just kind of combine the two together. There's no wrong answer in that. If you're feeling really fancy, if you have like a okay, there's a 1 in 6 chance of an encounter here, and here's my list of encounters. Instead of doing like a 1d20, you could do like 2d6, and that gives you kind of that bell curve. So you put your encounters you want more likely to happen in the middle, and the weirder ones toward the end. But you could also do that like if you're doing a D100 table of like on 75 to 80 this happens, but on 100 this only happens. You can weight them differently. So let's see. Any other advice on setting those up? Yeah, and I already talked about my categories of like natural NPCs, monsters, and weird, and you can weight them differently each time as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Dix, a while ago, and this is something I've been excited to talk about. You mentioned the like, why is this here? Why is this random encounter happening?
Yeah.
Um. So when you do your random encounters, like, what is your like? What do they look like for you? Like, what do you see when you look at the paper or whatever where they are?
Most of the time, it's a D20 list,
Mm-hmm.
and I normally have an option for each one. And like I said, I'd like to kind of weight them with things that aren't obviously a fight. Whether that be putting more humanoid creatures into the mix to where maybe they first think to chat instead of automatically fight. Maybe they're just finding some random item. Maybe they're finding a random set of clothes upon the ground that aren't in a pack. Nobody's around. There's no footprints. How did these get here? Uh, I had one really fun random encounter one time where I had rolled it up. I was actually using one of these books, which I wanted to put out real quick. So the Book of Random Tables by Matt Davids are great resources for random encounters. They're books full of different D100 tables. And they're not just random encounters. They have things for like, what would you find in a wizard's laboratory? City names, things like that. What would you find on a dead orc?
That's a resource right there.
Yeah, they're great. Check them out. They're fantastic, and they're super cheap. So I actually had one that I used out of one of these books where it was a swamp encounter, and they had to fight a giant crocodile, which at the time was super scary for the party, but they made it happen. And then afterwards, I rolled another one where they found a random chest kind of like on the bank in the swamp where they had just fought this thing. And so I used, again, more of these tables to kind of roll for it, and I determined what was in this chest. And at first, all the items seemed pretty normal. They found like a flask. They found like a dirty set of clothes. They found a what was it? I think like a broken like crystal drink set. But then the one thing that threw them off was they found a painting that was clearly done by a child of an elf that they did not recognize and had no name on it. And that just completely threw the group for a loop. They were like, what the hell is this? Whose belongings are these? Why is it out in the middle of the fucking swamp?
So why this is important, and this is great, because I was totally hoping this is where this would lead. You notice, like, these encounters weren't just like, here's 2d4 goblins, right? The thing it gave were those questions without answers where you had to play to find out, right? Like, I like to write random encounters as almost like a little story. Like, there's a little setup. Like, 2d4 goblins. Okay, that's a great starting point. But like 2d4 goblins fighting amongst themselves to see who gets like a sack in the middle of their camp.
Yeah.
What's in that sack? You can figure that out when you write the encounter, or you can wait until you're playing and see what would be the most fun. Like, and that's again like causes the DM to roll with it just as much as the players.
Yeah.
But that finding that artwork and the belongings of this person, like, I know I keep saying this, but it's a question without an answer, and that's just another little hook and another little barb that's gonna keep the players invested in the game. So when people think that like random encounters derail the game, like, yeah, they can, right? But like for folks to say like, okay, across the board, random encounters derail the game, you can never use them. Look what that did. Look how invested it got people into the game. And now, granted, like, you probably weren't planning on them having to deal with that, but that's part of the fun, right?
That was absolutely part of the fun. And the fact that I wasn't ready to like deal with them finding that, I got a moment to kind of sit there and listen to them talk about their findings and be like, whose stuff is this? Where the hell did it come from? Blah, blah, blah. And as I saw them really like start digging into this, I was like, okay, well, you guys search around a little bit more. And inside of this chest, you find a piece of parchment that you guys hadn't noticed before, where it basically had a note from somebody that said, this was their last chance. Make sure they don't get another one and make sure it's very far away.
Sorry, that's gold.
So they were able to put together like, oh shit, somebody clearly murdered someone and took everything they had and put it out here in the swamp so nobody would find it. We got to go. And so they like put everything back in the chest and just left.
That is excellent. Yeah, Todd, what you said about world building on the fly as part of the fun and challenge, like that was like a masterclass in that. That was fantastic. Oh, that's so fun. Todd, just make sure if it's a chest, you stab it first. Oh, yeah, Dungeons 101, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yo, but for real, what's in the sack? Okay, do you really want to know what's in what's in the sack? Tapshell, you're not going to like the answer to this question, man.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I wrote that without any thought as to what is actually in the sack.
As we do.
Yeah, that's like a future me problem. It's kind of like I just like wrapped my own present and put it underneath the Christmas tree, but drank about it long enough that I forgot what was in it.
Yeah, right.
So it's a surprise.
Future me is going to be real excited by this.
But yeah, so that's my advice for like leveling up your random encounters. If you're feeling like your random encounters are like a little flat and just feel like an excuse to start stabbing things, unless it's a chest, always stab the chest.
Always.
When you write them out, like, and you're thinking about like, okay, what monsters would be here in this area? Oh, maybe some gnolls. Okay, so there's like 1d6 gnolls. Like, also write down what those gnolls are doing, or at least what they want to do, or what they want. And you know, like, you're gonna get better at this the more you do it. So like, don't feel like you got to get every encounter right off the bat, and all of your encounters aren't going to be your best encounter because that's impossible, right? But yeah, like as you progress in it, think about like, okay, here's my creature, a gnoll. What's my hook, right? Like, what makes the players care, or like, what is the mystery that is this gnoll is going to bring to the game? Okay, so there's 2d6 gnolls, and they are driving a covered wagon really quickly. Okay, great. Everyone's going to want to know why for that, you know? And like, oh, there's torches burning on the wagon too. Oh, and you can hear a noise coming from the back of the wagon. Like, you know, just think like, what is the question going to be? And maybe you don't know the answer, and maybe you do. But if you know the answer from the get-go, like if I did know what was in that sack, the players won't when they get there, right? And that's what's going to make them interested. So when you're making your random encounters, like, think about the why. Think about, like, you know, hopefully after listening to this talk, someone making random encounters is going to, like, do a little less 2d4 kobolds and a little more, like, 2d4 kobolds, but they are trying to figure out how to reset this trap, and one of them's caught in it, you know?
Yeah.
Gnoll pioneers, like known frontier history. I'm pretty sure it was gnolls that went westward with Lewis and Clark I have to read my
Yep.
history books. It's been a while. Players, what does it sound like? DM, murder. The sweet sound of murder from the covered wagon.
Yeah, that's one thing I always try to do anytime I roll up a random encounter is ask at least a question. Why is this here? Why are these things doing this? Why is it important that they're in this area?
Yeah, totally. And if you can leave that, answer that question yourself, but leave it a mystery for the players, all the better.
Hmm.
Uh, and then they get to play to find out. You know,
Yep,
they get to figure
exactly.
out that question. Why are these ogres sitting? I mean, three ogres. Okay, three ogres sitting around a cask of mead, getting shit faced drunk. Okay, now that's a party. Like I want to know what's happening there. You
Yeah.
know. Uh,
And so does the party, I can guarantee it.
yeah, right. You know, someone's gonna try and approach them first before they attack. Probably at that point.
I mean, hopefully.
I mean,
Hopefully there's not just murder hobos.
but yeah, okay, you got a point there. Uh, skeletons coming to your camp because they saw fire and they're afraid of the dark. Yeah, that would mess with a party.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Oh, that's excellent. And you know, I think my favorite example to come out of tonight's discussion that I encourage everybody to put on a random encounter table is the Goblin Circle Jerk. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
Please don't do that. And if you got here after the Goblin Circle Jerk, you have a great reason to watch the replay. All right, so before I get into our little offer, Dix, you have anything else you want to talk about?
I think we've covered a pretty good amount. I guess just to summarize, uh, random encounters are fun. Your players will enjoy them if you give them a reason to. Don't just make it, oh, here's these things, fight them. And not everything has to be a fight.
Yeah, and I think that last one, I don't know, I thought to talk about it a lot in my notes beforehand, but that's an important one. Even your monster encounters don't have to be a fight. You know, think about what would be happening in that part of the world, and it doesn't always have to be death. I mean, it can be, though.
It can be.
Yeah, it can be.
Doesn't always have to
But
be.
it doesn't have to be. All right, so I imagine a lot of you got here through the email list. So you already know this little secret here. But for folks that don't, and you want to get yourself some random encounters and start filling out your random encounter list, or you want to see some examples or whatever, I got some freebies for you. If you go to freerandomencounters.com, freerandomencounters.com, you can sign up for Crumbling Keep's email list, and I'm going to send you like a little encounter or hook or something free tabletop RPG goodness every single day. My favorite right now series I have going for that is the Dark Domain Encounters because Ravenloft is trademarked. But at least once a week, there's a little spooky encounter that gets to your inbox. Oh, Nicole, you love the snails today. That's awesome. Uh, and if you don't know what that means, well, you should probably join the mailing list. But every single day, we send a little free RPG content to your inbox with some tips and advice, and also just like cool stuff I see that I think other people should check out. So again, that's freerandomencounters.com. Dix has put it in the chat.
There you go. Use it up.
Yeah, please do. So before we call it a day, folks, anyone got any questions or anything before we go?
Bring it on.
And again, thanks for everyone for sticking with us through that like absurdly mess of technical complications. The things we said before we even knew no one could hear us, golden, golden. Nicole, I would love to hear about that sometime.
Yeah,
I'm
that sounds
totally
great.
using them for my post-apocalyptic Western setting. That sounds hella fun.
And Sean, random encounters are not pointless. You are very correct.
Except for the Goblin Circle Jerk. There is no reason for that. There's no point. And just so we all know, when I end this little video and start Googling it, it's because I want to tell people that it's bad. That's the only reason why. Mutant Cowboys. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. This has been a blast. And Dix, thanks for joining me for this.
Of course. Anytime.
And cool. We will probably, hopefully, do more of these in the future. But have a great night, everybody, and thanks for checking us out.
Bye.
Bye.